Jasmine Neve to you. Jasmine Neve is Senior Lecturer at NADEL, Center for Development and Cooperation at ETH Zurich. Before joining NADEL, Jasmine worked for IOM in Mongolia, Foundation Base in Switzerland, and the Department of Environment in Victoria, Australia. Jasmine's main topics as a researcher are climate change, climate finance, disaster risk reduction, and environmental, that's such a hard word for me, migration. Welcome here in Bern, Jasmine Neve. Thank you.
Hi, good morning, everyone, and thanks so much, Nicoletta, for the introduction, and also to colleagues from Caritas for the invitation to speak today. So as mentioned, I was asked to speak about the implications of these biophysical impacts of climate change that Professor Stöcker just spoke about for societies around the world, looking at both the global north and also the global south. So I have 15 minutes, so I just have 3 key messages, must be the magic number today, and I'll just explain each of them in a little detail as I go. So the first message, if we go to the first slide, the first message is that the impacts of climate change are already, as we just heard, and will or are predicted to be far-reaching, affecting all sectors from agriculture to healthcare, and also all regions of the globe. So how is this so? I think this diagram from the Stockholm Resilience Centre explains it really well. This shows the biosphere as the non-negotiable foundation or the basis for all other sustainable development goals. We know that climate change is just one element of this biosphere, but it also interrupts and interacts with the others, with biodiversity, with fresh water, and with oceans. And our social and economic systems and all other SDGs exist within this biosphere and depend on this biosphere. So it's hence not surprising that with just around 1 degree or 1.2 degrees of warming, what we're already experiencing today, that climate change is already affecting all forms of life in every part of the world. It's caused widespread and pervasive impacts to ecosystems, to people, to sediments, also to infrastructure. It's reduced food and water security and has adversely impacted the physical and also the mental health of people around the globe. As we also just heard, many of these impacts, and perhaps the more obvious ones to us, result from the increase in the frequency and or intensity of climate and weather-related extremes, such as hot extremes on land or in the ocean, heavy precipitation events, fire weather, but also as a result of the cumulative effects of slower onset changes, such as sea level rise and saltwater intrusion, and also due to droughts. I'm sure we can all recall some of these events that we've already experienced in the past couple of years around the globe. We remember we are still witnessing the major drought over the Horn of Africa, which is in fact impacting people's lives and livelihoods, food security. Also the floods in Pakistan, which had major effects on life and also human health injuries. Infrastructure damage due to many different events we remember well. I expect the floods in Germany, more intense tropical cyclones in different parts of the world. And also impacts on ecosystems, including coral bleaching events as one example that not only impact, obviously, the ecosystem, but also the roughly 1 billion people around the world who rely on those ecosystems. And these sorts of events that we're already experiencing at the beginning of our journey into global warming are exactly what we expect to see more of in the future if we look forward to the year 2050 or 2100. Climate change is expected to damage assets and infrastructure, as we just saw. It's estimated that between $7 and $14 trillion worth of coastal infrastructure assets would be exposed by the year 2100. And as we also just heard, that historically rare extreme sea level events will start occurring annually by the end of the century, with some low-lying atolls being uninhabitable by mid-century. We also expect to see GDP losses. So if we look at the global level, we're looking at GDP losses of 10 to 23% again by the end of the century. Damage to ecosystems, both on land and in water. And we see here the example of coral reef damage to coral reefs, which is expected to be 70 to 90% at 1.5 degrees of warming, and almost all coral reefs at 2 degrees of warming. We also expect to see decreased crop yields, increasing the number of people at risk of hunger, impacts on water scarcity, and impacts on human health in multiple ways. And you can see in the schematic in the middle that just gives an overview of key impacts or key risks at the global level that you can see almost every sector represented there, from education to healthcare and food security. But of course, and a really important point here is that the severity of these impacts depends on what path we follow, because a world with 1.5 degrees of warming is very, very different to a world with 3 or 4 degrees of warming. We also see here a map of the world with various impact events that we experienced in the year 2022, that we are not immune. People living in the global north or in high income countries are not immune to these impacts. Climate change is expected to impact every part of the world. We recall well, the floods in Germany, wildfires in USA and Canada, heat waves in Europe and other parts of the Northern Hemisphere, floods also in Australia. So we know we're not immune. However, as we heard very clearly also from Francisca this morning, that, and this is my second key point, that although these impacts are felt in every part of the world, they're not felt equally in all parts of the world, in all regions or by all people. Across both sectors and regions, the most vulnerable people who are already marginalised, already living on lower incomes, are already observed to be and are expected to be disproportionately impacted by these types of events. So here we have another map that shows examples of impacts of climate change on lives and livelihoods in different parts of the world. And you can see the red and the orange shading indicates areas with higher vulnerability, and the green shading indicates areas with lower levels of vulnerability. I think we see here a pattern that we're quite familiar with. We see this pattern quite often. Examples of disproportionate impacts. We already see that people in low-income countries are more likely to die in climate and weather-related extremes. In the last decade, human mortality from floods, droughts, and storm events alone was 15 times higher in vulnerable regions compared to regions with low vulnerability, 15 times. We also saw earlier that climate change will increase the number of people at risk of hunger by mid-century by 8 to 80 million. This is expected with high confidence to be concentrated in sub-Saharan Africa, South Asia, and Central America. So again, we see these regional differences. And one more example, we also mentioned before global average losses in GDP by the end of the century. But actually the regional distribution of this is quite striking. So if we look at the lowest income, 40% of countries with the lowest income, they're expected to see declines in GDP by around 75% by the end of the century, relative to a world without climate change, while the richest 20% are expected to experience slight gains in GDP. So we see stark regional differences. Just a little bit, maybe this is too technical, but why? Why do we see this? Why do we see this pattern? And I think this schematic from IPCC explains it very well. Why? Because a hazard is not an impact. So these hazards that we just heard about, they become impacts or they become disasters when they interact with the exposure of people and their assets and their livelihoods to such events, and also with the vulnerability of those people or these assets to those events, whether they are sensitive to those effects, whether they have financial resources to prepare and to respond to such events. So we see that together these elements are what create this risk and what lead to these impacts on people. And we know that people who are already marginalised, already vulnerable, typically are more likely to live in climate-exposed areas, in river deltas, for example, along riverbanks. They're also more likely to rely on climate-sensitive sectors, such as agricultural fisheries, for their livelihoods, in some cases their entire livelihood. They're also less likely to be represented politically, and therefore may not get, for example, early warnings for disasters. And they're also much less likely to be insured and to therefore be able to build back from these events. However, this diagram, and I'll touch on this briefly in my last point, also has a positive message, because all of these different elements, the hazard, the exposure and the vulnerability, are elements that we can actually work with in order to reduce the risk of these types of events on people. So just quickly before I move on to the last point, however, we also see in what we've just been discussing around the impacts of climate change, that we obviously also have a justice issue here at hand, as Francisca also mentioned earlier. We know that people who are expected to be the most adversely affected, people who already are in fact the most adversely affected, living in lower income countries, for example. And of course another group who I haven't mentioned yet, the silent billions of people who have not been born yet and will actually be born into these futures, are in fact the people who have historically and also today who are the least responsible for this problem that we're facing. So it's therefore also a justice issue and a challenge for our commitment in the 2030 agenda to leave no one behind. So then my third and final message is this question: what does it mean for how societies will have to change? This is obviously a very big question, and I think we'll cover this a little bit more in other sessions today. But what does it mean in terms of adaptation, loss and damage, and also economic transition? And here I'll just touch on each of these very, very briefly. But the first key point, which has also been mentioned, but we will obviously need to mitigate greenhouse gas emissions. We need to reduce greenhouse gas emissions. This is very clear. We can reduce the extent of all of these impacts that we just discussed by doing this, by deep and rapid greenhouse gas emissions reductions. However, something to keep in mind is that these efforts to mitigate or reduce greenhouse gas emissions will also involve fundamental shifts in our economies around the world. There will be new jobs, new industries emerging, and also other industries that may disappear. And while this transition happens, something that we also need to focus on is making sure that this transition is a just one and we're not leaving further behind those who are already marginalised. The second point is that in all cases, as we already know, we will need to adapt to the impacts of climate change, to adjust our systems to these biophysical impacts, to, as we looked at before, reduce people's exposure, reduce their vulnerability to these impacts, or even reduce the severity of hazards through nature-based solutions, for example. And the third point that we'll also need to focus on, especially as an international cooperation community, that, as Professor Stöcke also said, there are obviously limits to adaptation, and no matter how well we do with mitigation, no matter how well we do with adaptation, there will still be some impacts that we will feel as a society that are beyond the limits of societies to adapt and lead to what we call losses and damages, so economic, social, and also cultural losses and damages in different areas around the world. And it'll be really important for us as a community to respond well to these events, because as we know, often the most severe impacts actually come after these events, when water after a tropical cyclone stagnates and causes dengue or malaria outbreaks, for example. So response to loss and damage events will also be really critical. So my very last, I'll call it a half point or a handover point, is that, as we know, these impacts are very rarely linear. They interact with each other in various ways. They compound and they cascade. And I just wanted to mention that many of these impacts that we discussed will also have implications for human mobility and migration, which I won't say more on because we have other experts here to talk about that. But I'm very glad that we have this topic as the focus of the conference today. And with that, that's all. So thank you. Thanks, everyone. Thanks, Nicoletta.
Thank you, Jasmine. I would also give you the possibility to ask a question. Yes, please, Vali. You will get the microphone, and please just introduce yourself.
Good morning, everybody. I have a question, but also I'd like Thomas to respond to this question too. So, mitigation, adaptation, or both. And given the budget constraints that exist around the world, I would like to know how we could go about it, how we will, divide budgets, money, finance between mitigation and adaptation. Thank you.
So, who wants to answer the question? Jasmine?
Yeah, I'll happily start. But look, I think it's the answer can only be both. We must do both because it's not adaptation is not an either or. We will need to adapt. We know that already because our world is already fast headed towards 1.5 degrees of warming, and we will need to adapt to that in order to avoid losses and damages. However, if we don't mitigate, we could be heading for a 3-degree world, a 4-degree world, and this is just by the end of the century. We should also keep in mind that societies will exist well beyond the end of the century, and if we don't mitigate, warming will continue well beyond the end of the century. So I think we really must do both. But there's also growing evidence that the cost of mitigation, or if we mitigate and we adapt, we're actually saving money by doing both of those things, avoiding loss and damage events, avoiding more severe climate change. So,
would you like to?
So it's all said already. The more you mitigate, the less you have to adapt. So.
But that is the long run, Thomas. What about now?
Mitigate.
Mitigate.
Information now. You could have started 50 years ago. We wouldn't be in this situation.
Right? The developing world needs adaptation. The developed world needs to mitigate. So
There is the Global Green Fund that is still not yet, replenished. That's our responsibility. So there are mechanisms, but they are still theoretical. And
We will talk about all this further on. Thank you, Vali. Thank you, Thomas. Thank you,
very much.
Jasmine, for this interesting presentation.